My sister laughed when she saw me arrive at the inheritance meeting with an old man in a battered wheelchair. 30 minutes later, her face turned pale because that old man was the one person who could destroy everything she had planned. So how did I, the sister she had just thrown out onto the street, end up walking into that room with him? My name is Joanna. I'm 30 years old, and I work as a custom tailor in Brooklyn. I've spent most of my adult life with fabric dust on my hands, needle marks on my fingers, and very small dreams that never required much money, just stability, dignity, and a place to belong. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how I lost my family, my home, and nearly my future, all within 48 hours, and how one single choice made on a hot Manhattan sidewalk changed everything. That morning, the city felt hostile. The summer sun pressed down on the gray concrete like a weight on my chest, trapping heat between buildings and turning the air thick and suffocating. Every sound felt louder than usual: the jackhammers from nearby construction sites, the impatient horns, the rush of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. I didn't. I was pushing myself forward on pure adrenaline, because that day was supposed to decide whether I still had a life in New York or whether I would officially become homeless, erased, not just from my parents' house, but from their legacy. 2 days earlier, my father had been buried. The soil on his grave hadn't even settled yet when my older sister, Martha, revealed who she really was. Growing up, people always said Martha was the successful one. She went into finance, worked at a hedge fund, wore tailored suits that cost more than my monthly rent, and spoke a language made of numbers and dominance. I was the opposite: quiet, practical, content with my sewing machines and loyal clients. When our mother fell ill years ago, I was the one who moved back home. I changed her bandages. I slept on the couch during long nights when the pain wouldn't let her rest. When my father's health declined, I did the same for him. Martha sent messages. Sometimes 5-minute phone calls when it fit between meetings. I never complained. I thought that was what family did. I was wrong. 2 days after the funeral, Martha walked into the kitchen of our childhood home with a thick stack of papers and a look so cold it made my stomach drop. She told me the estate was drowning in medical debt, that the funeral costs had drained all liquidity, and that I needed to sign the documents immediately to handle things efficiently. As I flipped through the pages, my hands started to shake. The numbers didn't make sense. The invoices were wrong, and buried beneath the legal language was the truth. If I signed, I would be giving up my legal claim to the house, the only home I had ever known. When I refused, Martha didn't argue. She attacked. She called me a burden, a glorified maid who had lived rent-free while she built a real legacy. She said my years of caregiving meant nothing because I hadn't contributed financially. That my hands that had dressed clients for weddings and funerals alike, were worthless compared to her bank statements. Then she grabbed my vintage sewing machine, my father's last birthday gift to me, and started shoving my belongings into old suitcases. I still remember the sound of the door slamming behind me as she threw my luggage into the hallway. The deadbolt clicked shut like a gunshot. Outside, rain streaked down the windows, and I stood there with nowhere to go, holding the only pieces of my life I had left. That night, I slept on the floor of my tailor shop, using folded fabric as a mattress. My back ached, but the pain in my chest was worse. And then my phone rang. It was Flynn, Martha's lawyer. His voice was calm, precise, and completely devoid of warmth. He informed me that the inheritance meeting scheduled for the next morning would finalize all outstanding matters. He warned me that contesting the debts would result in a defamation lawsuit, that my reputation would be destroyed, that I would never work in this city again. I understood then. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. This was a plan. By the time my alarm went off at 7 a.m., I already knew the meeting wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. I washed my face in the shop's tiny sink and carefully pressed my only formal navy blue dress. I didn't have money for new shoes, but I polished the ones I owned until they shone as best they could. Looking respectable was my last defense. As I finished getting ready, my best friend Becca arrived with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of bagels. She didn't say much at first. She just squeezed my hand in that quiet way that tells you someone sees your pain without needing details. "Don't let them rush you," she said softly. "And don't sign anything you don't understand." I nodded, even though fear sat heavy in my stomach. Just before I left, my phone buzzed again. A message from Martha. She warned me not to embarrass her by showing up looking like a failure. She reminded me of my place. She promised that if I caused a scene, she would make sure everyone in that building knew exactly how insignificant I was. I folded my documents into a worn leather folder and headed for the subway, only to discover the line was suspended due to a power failure. With time slipping away, I had no choice but to run. The heat ruined my carefully pressed dress. Sweat soaked through the fabric. My hair clung to my neck as I pushed through crowds of commuters who barely noticed me. My heels burned with every step, and with each block, I felt more like I was becoming exactly what Martha wanted me to be: disheveled, desperate, easy to dismiss. And then, near a massive construction site, I saw him, an elderly man in a wheelchair, stuck near a deep crack in the sidewalk, struggling to free himself while everyone else walked past without slowing down. His hands trembled with effort, his face was flushed and exhausted. I checked my watch. I was already late. And in that moment, I had a choice: walk away and save myself, or stop and help a stranger who could cost me everything. I didn't know it yet, but that decision would determine who walked out of the inheritance meeting alive and who walked out destroyed. And that is where my story truly begins. The truth is, the inheritance meeting didn't scare me as much as what had already happened before it. What truly broke me was realizing that my own sister had been planning my erasure long before our father took his last breath. 2 days after the funeral, the house felt wrong. The familiar warmth of our childhood home was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow silence that echoed through the rooms. The scent of incense still lingered in the air, mixing with the faint smell of old wood and dust. But instead of comfort, it felt like a reminder of something unfinished, something sacred that had been violated too soon. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a half-cold cup of tea, trying to process the reality that both of our parents were truly gone. I hadn't even cried yet. My body felt numb, as if grief had pressed a pause button on every emotion I owned. That was when Martha came in. She didn't look like a daughter in mourning. She looked focused, sharp, almost energized. Without saying a word, she began opening cabinets, pulling out folders, flipping through drawers where our parents kept important papers. Her heels clicked against the tile in a steady rhythm, each step filled with urgency. It felt less like someone searching for documents and more like someone hunting for treasure. "What are you doing?" I asked quietly. She didn't look at me. "I'm looking for the asset list," she said flatly, as if she were discussing groceries. "We need to move fast." Before I could respond, she dropped a thick stack of papers onto the marble countertop. The sound was loud enough to make me flinch. "These need to be signed," she said, "immediately." I picked them up, my fingers already uneasy before I'd read a single line: funeral expenses, hospital bills, outstanding balances. The numbers were overwhelming, deliberately so. But as my eyes scanned the pages, something felt off. Dates didn't align. Providers were duplicated. Some invoices looked copied. "Martha," I said slowly, "these don't make sense." That's when she finally turned toward me. Her expression was cold, calculated, empty of any trace of sisterly warmth. "The estate has no liquidity left," she said. "If you don't sign, creditors will come after the house. You don't want that on your conscience. Understand?" My heart began to race. I flipped further down the document, and there it was, buried beneath dense legal language. A clause that transferred ownership rights. A signature line that would quietly remove my legal claim to the house. I looked up at her in disbelief. "You're asking me to sign away my share," I said. "This is our home." Her lips tightened. "You lived here for free," she snapped, "while I was out building something real." The words hit harder than I expected. I reminded her calmly, At first, that I had moved back to care for our parents, that I put my career on hold to be there every day, that I had changed dressings, managed medications, stayed awake through nights when pain wouldn't let them sleep. She laughed. A short, humorless sound. "You were a caretaker, not a contributor," she said. "Don't confuse sacrifice with value." Something inside me cracked. As she paced the living room, her voice grew louder, sharper. She compared my work as a tailor to her job in finance, calling my income insignificant, my life choices embarrassing. She said the family's reputation mattered more than my feelings, that my presence in the house had been tolerated out of pity. I stood up, my hands shaking, and told her the truth that while she was busy chasing prestige, I was the one holding our parents' hands as they faded. That love wasn't measured in bank transfers. That's when she lost control. She marched into my workspace and grabbed my vintage sewing machine, the one my father had given me for my birthday years ago, the one he said proved I was building something honest. She yanked it off the table and slammed it onto the floor. Then she started throwing my belongings into old suitcases with frantic, angry movements. Clothes, fabric, notebooks, memories. "Get out!" she screamed. "You have no right to be here anymore." I tried to stop her, tried to reason, but it was useless. She dragged my suitcases to the door and shoved them into the hallway, just as rain began to lash against the windows. Her final words cut deeper than anything else. "Consider yourself officially evicted from this family." The door slammed shut, and the deadbolt clicked into place. I stood there in the dim hallway, my reflection distorted in the metal elevator doors, feeling like I had been erased. The rain soaked through my clothes as I struggled to move my suitcases toward the stairs, understand where I would even sleep that night. By the time I reached the street, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. It was Flynn. His tone was professional, polished, and utterly devoid of humanity. He informed me that the inheritance meeting scheduled for the following morning would finalize the estate. He warned me that any attempt to contest the debts would be considered defamation. "You should think carefully," he said. "Your sister has been very generous in allowing you to walk away quietly." I realized then that this wasn't impulsive cruelty. It was strategy. Timing, precision. They had waited until I was grieving, exhausted, alone. That night, I slept on the floor of my tailor shop, curled up on fabric scraps, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed outside. I replayed every moment, every word, wondering how blood could turn so cold so quickly. By morning, fear had settled into my bones, but beneath it was something else. Resolve. Because whatever happened at that meeting, I knew one thing for certain. I would not sign my life away in silence. And no matter how insignificant my sister tried to make me feel, I would walk into that office standing straight because dignity was the only thing they hadn't managed to steal from me yet. By the time I left my tailor shop that morning, the city had already decided to test me. The subway entrance was crowded, voices overlapping in irritation and confusion. An announcement echoed through the station, delayed service due to a power failure. I checked my phone. The minutes were slipping away faster than my breath. If I waited, I would miss the inheritance meeting. If I missed the meeting, Martha would win by default. I didn't hesitate for long. I turned around and ran. The Manhattan summer heat wrapped itself around me like a heavy blanket. With every block, the air grew thicker, carrying the metallic scent of construction dust and hot asphalt. My carefully pressed navy dress began to cling to my back. Sweat rolled down my spine, undoing every effort I had made that morning to look composed, respectable, worthy of being taken seriously. People rushed past me, briefcases swinging, eyes fixed forward. No one looked at me. No one noticed the woman fighting to outrun the collapse of her life. As I cut through a side street near a massive construction site, the noise intensified. Jackhammers rattled the ground, steel beams groaned as they were lifted into place, and the sidewalk narrowed dangerously around open trenches and uneven pavement. I slowed instinctively, my heart hammering not just from exhaustion, but from something else, a familiar sense of unease I had learned to trust over the years. That's when I saw him. An elderly man sat in a worn wheelchair near the edge of the sidewalk, One wheel caught deep in a crack in the concrete. His hands gripped the rims tightly as he tried to pull himself free, but the effort only made the chair tilt at an alarming angle. His shoulders trembled with strain. His face was flushed, and panic flickered behind tired eyes. People walked around him without stopping. A woman stepped over the edge of the sidewalk to avoid him. A man glanced down briefly, then kept going. It was as if he didn't exist, just another inconvenience in a city that never slowed down. I checked my watch. I was already late. For a single, awful moment, I stood there, frozen, my mind screaming at me to keep moving. This meeting was everything. My home, my future, my dignity. Helping him could cost me all of it. Then I saw my father's hands and my memory thin, trembling in his final weeks, still reaching out to help others even when his own strength was fading. I dropped my leather folder onto the ground and ran toward the man. "Please don't move," I called out, my voice louder than I expected. "Let me help you." He looked up at me in surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe someone had stopped. Together, we lifted the front wheels out of the crack. My arms burned as I strained, my heels slipping slightly on the dusty pavement, but after a few seconds that felt like forever, the chair rolled free. He let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," he said. His voice was raspy but steady. "You didn't have to do that. You're clearly in a hurry." I wiped sweat from my forehead and nodded. "I am, but some things matter more than being on time." He studied me for a moment, his gaze sharp despite his age. Most people don't believe that anymore. He introduced himself as Edgar. I offered to walk with him to a safer spot, away from the construction zone. As I pushed the wheelchair, I noticed how heavy it was, how every small crack in the sidewalk became an obstacle. My muscles protested, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When we reached the bus stop nearby, I realized something with a sinking feeling. The last bus heading toward the legal district was already pulling in. I helped Edgar up the steps, lifting with everything I had left. The bus was crowded and suffocating, packed with commuters pressed shoulder to shoulder. The smell of damp clothes and exhaust hung thick in the air. There was no designated space left for a wheelchair, so I stood beside him. Every time the bus jerked forward or slammed on the brakes, I braced my body against his chair, gripping the handrail with one hand and the back of the wheelchair with the other, using myself as a barrier to keep him from sliding. My shoulders ached, my legs trembled, but I stayed where I was. Edgar watched me quietly. "You don't seem like someone who usually lets herself be pushed around," he said after a while. I let out a humorless laugh. I used to think that too. Something about the way he asked made it easy to talk. Maybe it was his calm. Maybe it was the exhaustion stripping away my defenses. I told him briefly about the meeting, about my sister, about the lawyer who had threatened to erase me. I didn't tell him everything, just enough. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "People with sharp minds often mistake cruelty for strength," he said finally, "but cruelty always leaves a trail." I looked at him, surprised. "You speak like someone who's seen a lot of that." He smiled faintly, more than I ever wanted to. As the bus crawled through traffic, Edgar spoke about families he had known over the years, wealthy households where children grew up under the same roof but emerged as completely different people. Some carried kindness quietly. Others learned to step on anything softer than themselves. His words felt uncomfortably accurate. When I mentioned my father, Edgar's eyes softened. He described a man who believed character mattered more than success, who valued humility, who trusted actions more than promises. It felt impossible that a stranger could describe my parents so precisely. Before I could ask how he knew, the bus slowed to a stop near the towering glass buildings of the financial district. We had arrived. I helped Edgar off the bus, my arms shaking from fatigue. The building loomed above us, cold, reflective, designed to make people feel small. I checked the time. We had just enough minutes left. As we crossed the plaza toward the entrance, Edgar's breathing sounded strained. I bought him a bottle of water from a nearby kiosk, ignoring the small voice in my head reminding me it was my last cash. I knelt beside him and wiped the dust from his sleeves with my handkerchief. He watched me closely as he drank. "You're afraid," he said gently. I nodded, terrified. Good, he replied. Fear keeps us honest. I swallowed hard and admitted what I hadn't said out loud yet, that I didn't have the resources to fight my sister and her lawyer, that I was walking into a room where everyone already believed I'd lost. Edgar placed a firm hand over mine. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly, he said. Sometimes it waits for the right moment and the right witness. I didn't understand what he meant, but as we stepped through the glass doors together, I felt something shift inside me. A strange, quiet certainty settled in my chest, as if helping this man had anchored me to something stronger than fear. I still didn't know who Edgar really was. All I knew was that I was no longer walking into that building alone, and somehow, that made all the difference. The moment we stepped into the lobby, I understood exactly why people like my sister loved places like this. The floors were polished marble, so smooth they reflected the ceiling lights like a mirror. The air was cool and controlled, carrying the faint scent of expensive perfume and fresh paper. Everything about the space was designed to remind you who belonged and who didn't. I felt it immediately. My damp dress clung uncomfortably to my back, and my heels made a small, apologetic sound against the stone as I pushed Edgar's wheelchair toward the seating area. Around us, men and women in tailored suits moved with effortless confidence, their conversations quiet and precise, their eyes trained straight ahead. No one acknowledged us, not out of kindness, but indifference. I checked the time again. We had arrived with barely minutes to spare. Edgar looked tired. The bus ride had taken more out of him than he admitted, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the thin blanket draped over his legs. I spotted a small kiosk near the elevator bank and hesitated for half a second before reaching into my bag. It was the last of my cash. I bought a bottle of cold mineral water and knelt beside him, unscrewing the cap carefully so it wouldn't spill. As he drank, I noticed streaks of dried mud on his sleeves left over from the construction site. Without thinking, I pulled out my clean silk handkerchief and gently wiped them away. It felt important that he didn't look invisible here. Edgar watched me with a quiet intensity, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. He didn't stop me, just nodded once in thanks. That was when the sound of high heels cut sharply through the lobby. Click, click, click. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Martha's presence had always been like that, announced before seen. The sharp rhythm of her steps carried authority, impatience, and entitlement all at once. When I finally looked up, she was striding toward us from the elevator bank, dressed in a designer suit so crisp it seemed untouched by reality. Her hair was flawless, her makeup precise. She looked like a woman stepping into a victory she had already claimed. Beside her walked Flynn. He glanced at his gold wristwatch with thinly veiled irritation, as if the entire world existed solely to waste his time. His suit was perfectly pressed, his expression professionally bored, the kind of man who measured people by their usefulness within the first 3 seconds. Martha's eyes landed on me and then on Edgar. For a brief moment, confusion crossed her face. Then she laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to turn heads. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Joanna, I explicitly warned you not to embarrass me today." Her gaze swept over my sweat-stained dress, lingering just long enough to sting. "And now you show up with this?" She gestured dismissively toward Edgar's wheelchair, as if pointing at a stain on the floor. "Are you trying to win some kind of pity award?" My cheeks burned. Before I could respond, she leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to make the insult feel intimate. "You always had a talent for surrounding yourself with trash." Flynn smirked faintly, his eyes flicking toward my worn leather folder with open disdain. I felt my hands curl into fists. Edgar straightened slightly in his chair. "Young lady," he said calmly, "people who measure their worth by the height of their heels often stand on very hollow ground." Martha froze. Her face flushed a deep, angry red, as if she had just been spoken to by something she considered beneath her. "Excuse me?" she snapped. "You should keep your mouth shut and be grateful I haven't called security to remove you from this building." She turned to me, her smile sharp and cruel. "You really are a magnet for humiliation, Joanna." Then she reached out and snatched the bottle of water from my hand. Before I could stop her, she tipped it over. Cold water splashed across my shoes, soaking into my socks, pooling briefly on the marble floor before being absorbed into nothing. The sound felt louder than it was. A few nearby professionals paused, watching from a distance with carefully neutral expressions. "There," Martha said coolly. "If you have money to waste on charity cases, you should learn to dress like you belong here." I stood there, frozen. The humiliation hit me in waves, hot, dizzying, unbearable. My first instinct was to shrink, to apologize, to disappear. That was what she expected. Instead, I stepped forward. "This man is with me," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to carry. "And you don't get to insult him." Martha laughed again. "Listen to yourself. Defending a homeless stranger while your own life is falling apart. This obsession with helping the helpless is exactly why you'll always lose." She snapped her fingers sharply toward the security desk. 2 guards looked up. "Get this vagrant out of here," she ordered, pointing directly at Edgar. "He's harassing us." The guards hesitated, glancing between us. Without thinking, I moved in front of Edgar's wheelchair, positioning myself between him and the approaching men. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I didn't step aside. "He's my guest," I said, "and any attempt to remove him would be harassment." Martha's eyes widened in disbelief. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she snapped at the guards. "Do you know how much business my firm brings to this building?" Flynn stepped closer to me then, invading my personal space. He tapped the edge of his legal folder against my shoulder in a slow, patronizing rhythm. "Joanna," he murmured, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee, "you're already on thin ice. You should really consider how much worse this can get." I felt cornered. Martha blocked my path, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "This is how your story ends," she said softly, clinging to a broken old man while I walk out with everything. Throughout it all, Edgar said nothing. He simply watched. His gaze never left Martha's face, and there was something unsettling about the way he studied her, like a man taking notes, not emotionally reacting, but observing, measuring, recording. The lobby clock chimed softly, marking 9 o'clock. Martha lost what little patience she had left. "I will not have this building tainted by people like you," she shouted, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "If security won't do their job, I'll make sure they regret it." That was when Edgar finally spoke again. His voice was calm, controlled, powerful in a way that cut straight through the noise. "Are you quite finished?" he asked. "Or do you require an even larger audience for your lack of class?" The effect was immediate. The guards stopped. Conversations nearby fell silent. Even Martha seemed momentarily stunned, as if she had just been addressed by someone whose authority she hadn't recognized yet. I felt a chill run down my spine. In that moment, I realized something had shifted. The man beside me was no longer just an elderly stranger I had helped on the street. He was a witness. And whatever he had been watching so closely, my sister had just given him more than enough to remember. The conference room was colder than the lobby, even though sunlight poured in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The tables stretched across the room like a silent judge, polished dark wood, spotless, intimidating. Every chair looked expensive, heavy, permanent. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before sitting down, suddenly aware of how small I felt in a space designed for people who never doubted they belonged. Flynn took the seat at the head of the table without asking. He didn't need permission. He placed his briefcase down with practiced precision, opened it, and began laying out documents as if performing a routine he had perfected over years of dismantling people like me. Martha sat to his right, crossing her legs slowly, deliberately. Her confidence was effortless now, her earlier anger replaced by something far more dangerous certainty. She didn't look at me as a sister anymore. She looked at me like a problem she was finally about to eliminate. I sat across from them, my worn leather folder resting in my lap. Edgar positioned his wheelchair beside me, quiet, composed, his hands folded neatly, as if he were attending a meeting of his own choosing, rather than one he had been dragged into by circumstance. Flynn cleared his throat. Let's begin, he said briskly, already flipping pages. We're here to finalize the estate of the late Mr. and Mrs. Carter. He slid a thick document across the table toward me. This is a certified copy of the will, he continued. It clearly designates Martha as the sole beneficiary of all real estate holdings and financial assets. I stared at the paper. The signature at the bottom looked like my father's. At first glance, but something felt wrong. My chest tightened as I read the paragraphs describing me, my role reduced to vague language about non-contributing family members and occupancy without financial responsibility. According to this document, my years in that house had amounted to nothing more than tolerated inconvenience. Martha leaned back in her chair, watching my reaction with open satisfaction. Of course, Flynn added smoothly, there are also significant debts attached to the estate, medical expenses, funeral arrangements, taxes. He slid another stack toward me. The estate is essentially insolvent, he said, which makes this next step very important. Martha leaned forward then, pushing a single sheet of paper across the table. This is a waiver, she said calmly. Sign it and you walk away with $5,000. Cash. No complications. $5,000. The number felt insulting in its simplicity. I looked up at her. You're offering me charity, I said quietly. She smiled. I'm offering you mercy. My hands trembled as I picked up the pen Flynn placed in front of me. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the weight of the moment pressed down on my shoulders. If I signed, it would be over. No more threats. No more homelessness. No more fear. But also no truth. Flynn leaned forward, sensing my hesitation. Joanna, he said in a tone that pretended to be reasonable, you should understand that contesting this will only make things worse. We have documentation. We have statements. We can prove you were financially dependent. Martha tilted her head slightly. You always were, she said. You lived off sentiment, not value. The words cut deep, but I forced myself to stay still. I thought of the nights I slept on the couch, listening to my mother cry softly in pain. I thought of my father squeezing my hand, thanking me for staying when everyone else was too busy. I looked down at the signature line again. My fingers tightened around the pen. That was when Edgar moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt dramatically. He simply lifted his hand slightly, palm open. Stop, he said. The room froze. Flynn frowned, clearly irritated. Sir, this is a private legal proceeding. Edgar turned his head slowly, fixing Flynn with a steady gaze. Then you should be very careful about the documents you present in it. Martha laughed sharply. This is ridiculous. Why is he even here? Edgar didn't look at her. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket. The sound of metal against leather was soft, but in the silence, it felt thunderous. He placed an identification badge on the table. The seal caught the light. Flynn's face drained of color. I am the court-appointed legal custodian for the Carter estate, Edgar said calmly, and I have been for several years. The air shifted. Martha's smile faltered. That's not possible, she said quickly. Our parents never. They did, Edgar interrupted gently, because they understood the difference between wealth and character. He opened his battered briefcase and removed a pristine folder. Inside was a document sealed with official markings, the paper crisp, untouched by manipulation. The original will, Edgar said. The only one that carries legal weight. Flynn stood abruptly. This is highly irregular. What's irregular? Edgar replied. Is attempting to pass off a forged copy in a formal proceeding. The word forged echoed in my ears. Martha's breath hitched. You're lying. Edgar opened the document and began to read. There it was, my parents' voices, preserved in ink, their intentions unmistakable. The estate was to be divided, yes, but with conditions. A morality clause. Any heir found guilty of fraud, coercion, or mistreatment of immediate family would be disqualified entirely. Edgar looked directly at Martha. Your parents anticipated this, he said. They trusted observation more than promises. Flynn's hands shook as he flipped through his own papers. This clause, this could be interpreted. It can be enforced, Edgar said calmly. especially when supported by evidence. He turned his gaze to me then, softening slightly, which your sister provided very generously this morning. Martha shot up from her chair. What evidence? Edgar listed it methodically. The forged invoices, the attempted coercion, the public humiliation in the lobby, the offer of hush money in exchange for a signature. Each word landed like a blow. Martha's face went pale. This is absurd, she whispered. I was the responsible one. I was supposed to manage everything. Flynn backed away slowly, his confidence evaporating as the consequences settled in. I sat there in stunned silence, my heart pounding as the truth finally rose to the surface. The pen slipped from my fingers and rolled across the table. For the first time since my father died, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet, and I realized, with a strange mix of disbelief and gratitude, that the man I had helped on the street, the man my sister had mocked and dismissed, was the one person in that room who couldn't be bought. And because of that, everything was about to change. The silence that followed Edgar's words felt heavier than any shouting ever could. No one spoke, not even Martha. She stood frozen beside her chair, one hand gripping the edge of the table as if the floor beneath her had suddenly become unstable. Her confidence, so carefully constructed over years of dominance and control, crumbled in real time, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Fear. Flynn was the first to recover, though even he struggled to hide the panic creeping into his voice. This is highly irregular, he said sharply, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle even to his own ears. You can't simply walk into a private inheritance meeting and— I didn't walk in, Edgar replied calmly. I was invited. By the rightful heir. His words landed with quiet authority. Flynn's jaw tightened. That still doesn't give you the right to— It gives me every right, Edgar interrupted, still composed, to stop a fraudulent proceeding. He turned the original will so that it faced everyone at the table, his movements deliberate, unhurried. The document looked nothing like the copies Flynn had spread earlier. The paper was thicker, the seal intact. My father's signature at the bottom was unmistakable this time, not the stiff imitation I had noticed earlier, but the subtle, familiar slant I had seen on birthday cards and handwritten notes. My throat tightened. Martha shook her head violently. No, this can't be real, she said, her voice cracking. Our parents wouldn't do this. They trusted me. They trusted observation, Edgar corrected gently, not appearances. He began to read aloud. Each sentence felt like my parents were speaking directly into the room, cutting through lies with clarity they had always possessed in life. The will outlined the division of assets, yes, but more importantly, it outlined values, responsibility, integrity, compassion. Then Edgar reached the clause that made Martha's breath catch, the morality provision. It stated clearly that any heir who engaged in coercion, deception, or mistreatment of immediate family would forfeit their claim entirely. No appeals, no exceptions. Martha sank back into her chair. That clause was meant as a deterrent, Flynn argued weakly. It's subjective. It's enforceable, Edgar replied, especially when behavior aligns so perfectly with anticipation. He looked at Martha again, not with anger, but with a measured disappointment that felt far more devastating. You were warned, he said quietly. Not today. Years ago. You simply assumed consequences were for other people. Martha's hands trembled as she pressed them flat against the table. I was protecting the estate, she whispered. She would have ruined it. She doesn't understand how the world works. I finally found my voice. I understood how to stay, I said softly. When they needed someone. She turned toward me, eyes wide and glassy. You always play the victim, she snapped, desperation bleeding through her anger. You hid behind sentiment while I carried the burden of success. Edgar closed the will. What you carried, he said, was entitlement. Flynn took a step back, sweat visible along his hairline now. This meeting needs to be adjourned, he said quickly. We'll review this document through the proper— There will be no adjournment, Edgar said evenly. Not today. He pulled out a thin folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table toward Flynn. Those are records, he continued, of inconsistencies in the invoices you presented. Duplications. Altered dates. Vendors who do not exist. Flynn stared at the folder without opening it. And this, Edgar added, placing another document down, is a written account of the attempted coercion that occurred in the lobby this morning. Witness statements included. Martha's face drained of color. You recorded me? She whispered. I observed you, Edgar replied. There's a difference. Flynn swallowed hard. You can't seriously be suggesting. I'm suggesting, Edgar said calmly, that you should consult your own counsel. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the reality of consequences. Flynn's practiced composure finally shattered. He began gathering his papers with frantic movements, no longer looking at me or Martha, only at the door. This is a misunderstanding, he muttered. We'll resolve this quietly. No, Edgar said simply. You won't. He turned toward me then, his expression softening for the first time since the meeting began. Joanna, he said, your parents named you primary executor of the estate. The words didn't register at first. What? I whispered. He nodded. The penthouse, the remaining funds, all transferred to your name, effective immediately. Martha let out a broken sound, half laugh, half sob. That's impossible, she cried. I was the successful one. I earned it. You earned your position, Edgar said, not their trust. Flynn backed away toward the door, his face pale. I have clients waiting, he said weakly. You'll have inquiries waiting, Edgar corrected, from the appropriate professional boards. Flynn didn't argue. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, far quieter than the one that had locked me out of my home days earlier. Yet the echo felt just as final. Martha remained seated, staring at the table as if it might open up and swallow her whole. I didn't think it would end like this, she murmured. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just a deep, aching sadness. You ended it yourself, I said quietly. Long before today. She reached for my hand, her grip desperate. We can fix this, she pleaded. We can work together. I'll help you manage everything. I gently pulled my hand away. No, I said. That's over. Edgar rose slightly in his chair, signaling the end of the meeting. Security will escort Miss Carter out, he said calmly. Martha looked up sharply. You can't. But 2 guards were already at the door, the same guards she had summoned earlier. They helped her to her feet. She didn't resist, but she didn't stop looking back at me either, her expression unraveling as she was led away. When the door closed again, the room felt strangely peaceful. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath for days. Edgar turned to me once more. Your father hoped you'd never need this, he said, but he prepared anyway. Tears blurred my vision. I only helped you because it felt right, I said. I didn't know. He smiled faintly. That's exactly why they trusted you. As we left the conference room together, the weight that had been crushing my chest finally lifted. I had walked in expecting to lose everything. Instead, I walked out with something far more powerful than inheritance. I walked out with the truth. And for the first time since my parents were gone, that truth felt like solid ground beneath my feet. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly everything collapsed for my sister. It was how quiet it became afterward. Once Martha was escorted out of the conference room, the space felt strangely hollow, as if all the air had been sucked out along with her certainty. The polished table no longer looked intimidating. The walls no longer felt like they were closing in. For the first time since my father died, I realized I could breathe without my chest tightening in protest. I stayed seated for a moment, my hands resting flat on the table, grounding myself in the reality that this was actually happening, that I was still here, that I hadn't been erased. Edgar remained beside me, calm and unhurried, as if moments like this were not victories to celebrate but conclusions that simply needed to be reached. He gathered the documents neatly, separating truth from deception with the same care someone might use to fold a letter meant to be kept. Across the room, Martha's chair sat empty. The image lingered in my mind, her confident posture only minutes earlier, her voice dripping with superiority, the certainty with which she had believed the world would bend for her one last time. Watching it all unravel had not brought me the rush of triumph I once imagined. Instead, it left behind a heavy stillness. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. Edgar looked at me. "Are you all right?" I nodded, though tears threatened to spill. "I think so. I just didn't expect it to feel like this." "Justice often disappoints those who expect revenge," he said gently. "It gives something quieter instead." The door opened again, and a building administrator stepped inside to confirm the transfer of assets had been initiated based on the original will and supporting documentation. The words felt distant, almost unreal, like someone was reading the conclusion of a story I had stopped believing in halfway through. The penthouse, the remaining funds, my parents' legacy. All of it was now legally mine. As the formalities wrapped up, I caught sight of Martha through the glass walls of the hallway outside. She was sitting on a bench, her designer suit wrinkled now, her hands buried in her hair. The security guard stood nearby, not touching her, just watching, waiting. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. When our eyes met, something inside me twisted painfully. She stood up abruptly and rushed toward the door, pounding once before it opened again. She stepped back into the room, tears streaking down her face, pride completely abandoned. "Joanna, please," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't do this to me." I didn't answer right away. She took a step closer. "I was wrong, okay? I went too far. But we're still sisters. We can fix this. I can help you manage everything. You need me." Her words echoed eerily with all the times I had needed her before, when our mother was sick, when our father's hands shook too badly to hold a glass of water, when the house felt unbearably quiet and I had asked her to come home just once. She hadn't needed me then. Now she did. "I never wanted to do anything to you," she continued desperately. "I just wanted what I deserved." I finally spoke. "What you deserved," I said quietly, "was honesty, and you chose cruelty instead." She reached for my hand, gripping it tightly, her fingers cold and trembling. "Please," she whispered, "don't destroy me." I gently but firmly pulled my hand away. "I'm not destroying you," I said. "I'm just not saving you anymore." The guard stepped forward, responding not to my words but to Edgar's subtle nod. Martha didn't resist as they guided her toward the door, but she kept looking back at me until she disappeared down the hallway. The door closed softly behind her. That sound didn't feel like victory. It felt like an ending. I sank back into my chair, exhaustion washing over me in waves. My body ached from days of tension I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. Edgar remained standing nearby, giving me the space to process everything that had happened. "I never wanted her to lose everything," I said after a while. Edgar nodded. "Most people don't want others to fall. They just want the harm to stop." There was a pause. Then he added, "Your parents hoped it wouldn't come to this." I swallowed hard. "They knew," I said softly. "Didn't they?" "They suspected," he replied. "Enough to prepare." The thought hurt more than I expected. Knowing my parents had seen the possibility of this fracture forming within their own family and had trusted a stranger to safeguard what love could not. "Why me?" I asked. "Why leave everything to me?" Edgar met my eyes. "Because you stayed when staying cost you something." The words lodged deep in my chest. Outside, raised voices echoed faintly as Martha continued to protest, her composure fully unraveling now that no one was listening. It was painful to hear, not because I doubted my choice, but because I mourned what could have been if greed hadn't hollowed her out. Flynn never came back. Later, Edgar informed me calmly that formal complaints would be filed regarding his conduct, supported by documentation that spoke for itself. I didn't feel satisfaction at the thought of his career collapsing, only relief that he would no longer have the power to intimidate others the way he had tried to intimidate me. When everything was finished, when signatures had been exchanged and confirmations issued, Edgar wheeled himself toward the door. I followed him into the hallway. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling inadequate but sincere. "I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't met you." He smiled faintly. "You would have survived," he said, "but today reminded you that survival doesn't have to mean surrender." As we exited the building together, sunlight flooded the plaza outside. The sky looked clearer than it had that morning. the heat less oppressive, the noise of the city somehow easier to bear. Edgar paused beside a sleek black sedan waiting at the curb. "You did the right thing," he said. "Not just today, every day before it." I watched as he was helped into the car, his presence receding into the stream of traffic until he was gone. I stood there alone for a moment, feeling the weight of the past finally loosen its grip. I had walked into that meeting expecting humiliation. I walked out having reclaimed my home, my name, and something even more important, my dignity. And for the first time since my parents were laid to rest, I understood that endings, no matter how painful, sometimes arrive to make room for a future that no longer requires you to beg for your place in it. When the glass doors closed behind me, the city felt different. It wasn't quieter, Manhattan never truly is, but the noise no longer pressed against my chest the way it had all morning. The heat was still there, the traffic still crawling, the people still rushing past with their own private urgencies. Yet something inside me had finally settled, like dust sinking after a storm. I stood on the plaza for a long moment, breathing in air that felt lighter than it had just hours earlier. For days, my life had been reduced to survival: where to sleep, how to eat, how to defend myself against the people who shared my blood but not my values. I had walked into that building expecting to lose the last thing tying me to my parents. I walked out carrying something heavier than documents or keys. I carried closure. Edgar's car disappeared into traffic, leaving behind the quiet certainty of his words. He hadn't saved me because he was powerful. He had intervened because he had been watching character reveal itself when no one thought it mattered. I began the slow walk back toward the subway, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. This time, I didn't rush. For the first time in days, there was no clock chasing me. As I descended the steps into the station, I thought about my parents not as they were at the end, fragile and tired, but as they had been when I was younger. My mother teaching me patience with careful hands. My father reminding me that honest work didn't need applause to have value. They had trusted me long before they trusted paperwork. That night, I returned to my tailor shop not because I had nowhere else to go, but because it still felt like mine. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and let myself finally sit down without fear pressing against my spine. The sewing machines hummed quietly when I turned on the lights, familiar and grounding. Rolls of fabric lined the shelves like old friends who had waited without judgment. I realized how close I had come to losing not just my home, but the life I had built piece by piece with my own hands. I didn't sleep much that night, but not from anxiety. My mind was busy in a different way, sorting through memories, regrets, and possibilities I had never allowed myself to imagine. The next morning, I returned to the house, our parents' house. The doorman greeted me with a respectful nod I had never received before. The elevator ride up felt surreal, every floor marking a step back into a space I had been violently removed from not long ago. When the doors opened, I stood there quietly, keys resting heavy in my palm. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it too, exactly. The couch where my father used to nap, the armchair where my mother would sit and watch the afternoon light shift across the walls. For a moment, grief hit me hard enough that I had to steady myself against the doorframe. I didn't cry right away. Instead, I walked through each room slowly, touching surfaces, reopening windows, letting air move freely again. It felt important to cleanse the space, not of memory, but of bitterness. In the kitchen, I found the mug I had been using the day Martha brought in those papers. It still sat by the sink, untouched. I rinsed it carefully, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. Some things deserve gentleness. Even after everything, Martha never came back. I heard later that she moved out of the city quietly, her professional reputation fractured beyond repair. Flynn's name began circulating in conversations no one wanted to be part of. Consequences moved efficiently when truth was allowed to breathe. I didn't celebrate any of it. I spent weeks settling affairs, meeting with people my parents had trusted, learning details about finances I had never cared much about before. Each meeting reminded me of something Edgar had said, that wealth was a responsibility, not a reward. I thought often about the moment at the construction site, about how close I had come to walking past him, about how easily fear could have turned me into someone else. That realization changed me. With time, I made decisions that surprised even myself. I restored the tailor shop instead of closing it. I hired 2 apprentices women who reminded me of myself years ago, talented but overlooked. I set aside part of the inheritance for a small program offering free tailoring and repair services to elderly residents in the neighborhood. It wasn't about charity. It was about dignity. Sometimes, when I locked up the shop late at night, I would remember Martha's words, how she had mocked my obsession with helping others. I understood now that she hadn't been wrong about one thing. Helping people had shaped my life, but not in the way she believed. One afternoon, weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. It was from Edgar. He didn't write much, just a few lines telling me he was well, that he had returned to a quieter life now that his work was done. At the bottom, he wrote something I still keep folded in my wallet. "Kindness isn't currency," it read. "It's a compass." I sat at my work table for a long time after reading that, letting the hum of the city fade into the background. Looking back now, I understand that my sister didn't lose because she was cruel. She lost because she believed cruelty was strength. What saved me wasn't luck, or strategy, or even justice, in the dramatic sense. It was consistency, the kind built slowly through years of choosing compassion when no one was watching. I didn't win because I was smarter. I endured because I stayed human. And if there is one thing my story has taught me, it's this. Real wealth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear suits or demand applause. It reveals itself quietly, in moments when you choose to stop, to help, to protect someone else, even when the cost feels unbearable. That choice gave me back my home. But more importantly, it gave me back myself. And that is an inheritance no one can ever take away. Before this story ends, I want to pause for a moment not to talk about inheritance or money, but about what this journey truly revealed. This video was never just a tale of betrayal or a dramatic legal reversal. At its core, it is a quiet study of character. It asks a difficult question many of us avoid. Who do we become when no one is watching, and when kindness costs us something real? Throughout the story, power shifts, not because of wealth or intimidation, but because of integrity that refuses to break under pressure. The contrast between greed and compassion, between performance and authenticity, is what gives this story its emotional weight. Justice doesn't arrive with noise or spectacle. It arrives through patience, observation, and the courage to remain human, even when being human feels like a disadvantage. If this story resonated with you, it may be because you faced moments where doing the right thing felt lonely, or where standing your ground meant risking everything. Stories like this exist to remind us that dignity still matters, and that quiet strength often outlasts loud cruelty. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If you enjoy thoughtful, emotionally driven stories about life, betrayal, and redemption, I invite you to subscribe to Hanjiwiye Yagi. Your support helps this space continue telling stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark.